I often ask clients what do they look for when they purchase a ram, and they invariably often say to me, they say, look, we look at the ram, and if we like the look of the ram, we then look at its ASBVs and its figures, and then if they align, we make a decision on that. And I often think that's really interesting, because really what we're trying to do is, when we buy a ram, is we're trying to determine how its progeny will perform effectively for the next future 3 or 5 years, depending on the role that ram plays in that business. So I think it's very interesting that's the process they go through. And I often ask myself why, or how, or why do they do that? And I think farmers and maybe people in general are very visually orientated, so they like to look at something and they say to themselves, if that animal looks good to me, and if I could produce animals like that please me. So I think that's a good decision. While if I think a bit deeper about it, I'm actually saying to myself, a prime lamb enterprise, be it maternal or terminal, is fundamentally a performance-based enterprise, which means to drive profit, how many kilos of lamb we produce per hectare and how quickly we produce those kilos will ultimately determine profit. So it's very much a cost of production enterprise, and we can talk a lot about marketing and all the rest of it, but fundamentally, based on where the market is at that particular time you sell, we generally get very similar prices. So we can't do a heap in the area of marketing, but we can do a heap in the area of cost of production. And ultimately, cost of production is going to be driven by how fast those lambs get to market, so how many kilos of lamb you produce per hectare and how quickly they get there. So the interesting thing about when you look at how you select a ram is, by looking at a ram, you can't really get a very good understanding of those issues, because basically you're looking at an animal and saying to yourself, well, that animal looks great, which really is an expression of its genetic potential, but the only measure of its genetic potential you have are its ASBVs, so it's sheep breeding values. And the great thing about sheep breeding values is that if you look at what drives your profit in your performance prime lamb enterprise, it's going to be growth, how quickly they get to specification weight, the weight that you want, how fat they are, how much muscle they have, and all those things are measured with measurable traits, and they're all measured through Australian sheep breeding values. So obviously they are the things that you need to focus on to determine ultimately profitability of the size that you're buying into your business. If it's maternal, so you're obviously going to be looking at other traits also, such as fertility, but the logic stands that those traits are all measurable and can all be selected. It seems a pretty simple message, but if we go back to where we started, when I asked a lot of my colleagues and other farmers, how do they go through that process of selecting rams, they're still very visually orientated. And I often think, well, why is that? And I think there's a lot of mixed messaging in the prime lamb industry. I think breed societies often market themselves as a brand rather than a breed society, which I think's quite heavily conflicted, because ultimately a breed's not going to determine your profitability. What will determine your profitability is the genetics of the ram's performance, and breeds don't ensure performance. We know within every breed there's a massive range of performance. So I don't think it helps that the breed societies take that position. Industry makes a lot of statements that don't really make a lot of sense when it comes to the prime lamb enterprises. We often talk about peas in a pod, lambs looking like bricks, all those sorts of things, throwaway sort of comments. But if we think it all through, and we go right through to the retail end, and we think about a lamb, for a butcher, the most profitable lamb is going to be a lamb that looks like a triangle, because we know there's no value, or the lowest value cuts are nearly all in the forequarter. So the butcher's going to want that lamb carcass laden with weight in its loin and its rear end fundamentally. So we know that we really should be saying lambs should look like triangles, and we know from a farmer's point of view, lambs with narrow shoulders will help with birthing ease and lambing. So there's never been any logic to have lambs as square brick type characters, but the industry often used to run with that sort of theme. So it just shows you we haven't thought through what drives profit in that enterprise. So even in our seed stock business, where we have to select size, we can be quite conflicted also until we think through the process of what we're trying to achieve, because you can have a ram that has a great hind quarter, plenty of flesh down the legs, and has actually a low ASBV for muscle. So even though we know that that ram will throw some progeny that do have that characteristic, the majority of its progeny will be low in muscle. And when we consider that the back loin muscle is the muscle that we measure to determine that ASBV, and that follows through to the value in the retail cuts, we know that that's if we're going to select for muscle, you might as well be selecting for muscle, not just fleshy hindquarters as such. So we even have to make that decision where we put the priority back on an ASBV or a trait that we know that's measurable, rather than on what something just looks good. And so that can even be challenging in our own business. I think often lamb plan's is not well understood. It's basically a giant progeny test across the industry. It's an incredibly powerful tool that's available to the industry, and a lot of people try and discredit its substance because of individuals who put the data in, etc. They argue that there's variability in all those sorts of issues. Of course, there may well be, but from our point of view, and from most seed stock business point of view, we're making in-house decisions in our business based on that information and those traits and how they perform. So accuracy is really important, and so it's quite an incredible system where that individual need to drive your own business feeds into a bigger pool of data that then the whole industry can use to identify the best genetics. So if we get back to where we started, how do we make a selection for a ram? I think, I'd argue that looking at the ram and then looking at the figures is back to front. We should be looking at the figures, making sure that those figures will meet our breeding objectives, be it a terminal selection process or maternal, making sure the figures support those breeding objectives we have for those enterprises, and then look at the ram and make sure that the ram meets your other characteristics. But in terms of the weighting of the decision, we know in prime lamb enterprise is a performance-based enterprise, so all the traits that drive that performance are the traits that we have to put the highest value on, because that drives profit. Now, if you disagree with that, that's fine. Everyone's free to do whatever they like, so that's fine. But you can't sit around the kitchen table and say to your family, look, we're a farm, but now we're also a business, and we're focused on being a business, and we're focused on driving profits, and by doing that we'll be sustainable. Because if you're serious about that, you have to get back to driving performance in your prime lamb enterprise, and that means using ASBVs and objective traits to drive that performance, rather than something that you just think that looks good.